If you would join me once again, one more time in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we have one more week. I could have wrapped it up this week, but this is going to be, I wanted to reserve the final verses of the book of Ecclesiastes because I think there's enough there that it deserves an entire sermon to itself. So I'm going to fly through a couple of passages here. These remaining chapters of Ecclesiastes is basically the wise old Solomon who has spent a lifetime doing foolish things, saying wise things, giving wise advice, but not necessarily living up to that wise advice, living as a foolish king. And he is looking back over the hallways of his life. And now he, in this final couple of chapters here, he's really beginning, you'll notice as we read through it, he's really beginning to think a lot about the youth. Why is it that the youth squander their youth? Why is it that it's only when you're aged and your hair is gray and falling out that you really begin to think more seriously about spiritual things, more seriously about life? I mean, look around in the room this morning. I know it's the early service, and that's typically the more mature, we'll put it that way, more mature. There are, believe it or not, this is funny, there are people in our church that can't make it to the last service today because they're still in bed. They can't wake up. I say, come on, seriously, come on. You get up to go to work, don't you? In school, you can certainly on Sunday get up to come to church, but typically the first service is not the most attended, and you don't typically see as much youth in it. But generally speaking, all across America, it doesn't matter what church you go to. Generally speaking, it's more the aged who are in church. And why is that? Well, you don't just mature in wisdom as far as life skills and knowledge as you grow older, but you grow wiser typically, you should at least, when it comes to spiritual matters in life too. How many of you wish that you could grab that younger version of you and sit yourself down in a chair and just say, look, I want to speak some sense into you. I want to tell you what life is really like, and that those dumb things that you're about to do, like seriously, you're going to regret that. And there's going to be years where you look back and say, if I had only not done that or said this or went there, why was I not thinking more clearly? Where was wisdom then? All of us are probably, I've heard people say many times over the years, I wouldn't change a thing. It's like, well, you're an idiot. Like all of us look back to something in the past. Yes, I would change that. I would not have done that. It's like, if you're saying, oh, I wouldn't change it, that's because you're so old you've forgotten everything. You're only remembering the good things. And Solomon, certainly, he hasn't forgotten. He's remembering a lot, and he's looking back over the hallways of his life, and he's thinking, I wish things would, certainly I knew better. The wisest man that has ever lived. And I instructed people on how to live a wise life, and somehow I failed myself utterly to do those things. Well, that's what brings us to chapter number 10. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in chapter number 10. Most, if not all, of Bible scholars that I'm aware of struggle over, in fact, you have probably never, no matter how long you've been going to church, you probably have never heard a sermon through Ecclesiastes chapter number 10. Generally speaking, most Bible teachers, pastors, they'll glance over it and maybe look at a verse or two of it. But linguistically, what we got to remember, we're talking about a book, generally speaking, that was written nearly 3,000 years ago. And much of the language that's used in it, in the dead Hebrew language that it was written in, is dealing with subjects of the day or poems or riddles that the people of that time would have been familiar with. And as I've mentioned a time or two already in our study in Ecclesiastes, linguistically, with the language, the original language, there's challenges. This is why this is the most difficult book in the Bible for many Bible scholars and Bible teachers to teach. Now, with that said, you can still glean general ideas about what he's trying to draw out, and you can come to the conclusion on a lot of this. For instance, verses 1 through 7, it appears that he's speaking about foolish rulers and the struggles there. In verses 8 through 10, foolish workers. Verses 11 through 15, foolish talkers, or those that say things that are just, they shouldn't be saying. Verses 16 through 20, foolishness of a young king. And I tend to think that he may be even referring to himself in these verses. In fact, if you look at verse number 16, it says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princess feast in the morning." Another way of wording that would be, a country is in trouble when its ruler is childish and its leaders party all day long. If those that are in charge, if those in your cabinet are getting drunk in the morning or partying, and you, as a young leader, as a young king, you don't really care about anything other than living for yourself, you're just taking advantage of your power, then woe to your country. And we've seen examples of that, even in our own lifetime. We've seen examples of this in other countries. Here in America, we don't experience monarchies, but even in other countries where those that are in their youth become monarchs and they become powerful and wealthy overnight, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've heard that. When you're given that freedom to do what you want, however you want, and nobody can tell you the otherwise. It's hard to restrain yourself, particularly if you're youthful. This is one of the reasons why in the New Testament that Paul gives instructions when it comes to pastors of churches, that they are not to be novice. You don't just throw a young guy into the position of being a pastor, because that's a lot of authority. It's a lot of, you have a lot of responsibility as a pastor. You don't just throw a young guy into that role, because there's dangers that come along with that. And Solomon, as a teenager, most Bible historians believe that he was possibly anywhere from the age of 14 to 19. And that's a lot of power to be given when you're in that age bracket. I've read somewhere that 90% of the bad decisions that you'll make in life is somewhere between the age 18 and 26. And some of you, if you sit there and think about it long enough, you're like, yep, that's when I made all of mine, and it took a long time to get past some of them. So now imagine imagine what your life would be like if you were a billionaire between the ages of 18 and 26. It just amplify because the struggles that come along with that. And so Solomon here, he says, woe to the country, woe to the land, woe to the people who have a childish king who allows all of the leaders in the land to do nothing but party. Go to verse 17, he says, "Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles and your princess feast at the proper time." When literally the leaders are doing what they're supposed to do, and there's organization within the kingdom, and you're leading as if you're someone who is noble. He goes on to say, "For strength is not for drunkenness." In other words, you weren't given money and power so that you could squander it by partying. It's interesting in fact, I've done this a time or two with the youth. I ask them, what would you do with $1 million? Or what would you do with $1 billion? It is, for us who have a few more years, you would not believe some of the things. I asked this, I think it was a couple of weeks ago in our Wednesday night program with some of the kids in Awana. What would you do? I gave a card to one of the kids and said, this is worth $40,000. What are you going to do with it? And I think he said he was going to buy candy. So that you kind of, like if I gave you $40,000, candy would, in 100 years, that would not have popped into your head. That would not have popped into your head. You're thinking totally different. And so when you give youth money and power like that at such a young age, they're not going to think clearly, wisely, accurately about what to do with it. He says in verse number 18, "Because of laziness the buildings decay, and through idleness of hands the house leaks." In other words, because you're so focused on partying and getting drunk and squandering the power and the money that you've been given, everything else is starting to fall apart. You're not willing to work and do the upkeep. And once again, this may be Solomon looking back over his life. He was more than happy to build stuff, lots of stuff. But maybe over the years, he got so focused on all the other things that he wanted in life to fulfill his lustful pleasures that everything that he had built began to, little by little, materially speaking, fall apart. In verse number 19, he says, "A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything." Let me read that in the NLT. It words it this way: "A party gives laughter, wine gives happiness, and money gives everything." Now, unfortunately, a lot of people have memorized that verse and have taken it to heart and says, this is Bible. This is what God tells you, that you should laugh as much as you can, so party, and that alcohol makes you happy, so go get drunk, and money answers everything. That money is the solution to everything. So you're like, that's from the wisest man in the world. That's solid advice. And let me back up and put some new information in there. This is Solomon basically giving you the mentality of a young, foolish king. That's not wise advice. That's how a young, powerful, and rich king, foolishly squandering his life away, that's how he would think. If I only had more parties, more fun, more wine, and money, if I had more money, I could do whatever I want to do. So tax the people more, which is exactly what Solomon did. First Kings tells us a little bit about the life and the kingdom of Solomon, and it describes how burdened the people were. In the early years, they loved him as a king. They had never heard anyone like him. They'd never had a king that did the things that he had done. But over time, King Solomon became such a burden to the kingdom of Israel that all they were doing was seeing their sons and daughters go into to work for the king, and they were losing their money left and right because there were taxes everywhere they went, because they had to fund all that was being built and all the roads and all that was going on, that it was a burden to live under his kingship. But the mentality of Solomon was basically party and money, and if there's problems, money will fix it, and I'll just tax the people and I'll get more money. We think that way in America as well as many other places in the world. Just more taxes. Just print more money and more taxes and everything's solved. It's so easy. I heard a millennial recently. The problems with inflation in our country is so easy. Just print a whole bunch more money and raise taxes on the rich, and everything's solved. Everything is solved. Money will just fix it all. And this is how a youthful mind would think. This is how someone who doesn't understand how economies work, how the kingdom works. This is why wed age, you get wisdom. You realize, that you can't do these things. That doesn't work. That has been tried many times. And so Solomon says, well, money will answer everything, but it certainly does not answer everything, and he has proved that a time or two already in the passages that we've looked at previously. But where I really want to focus in on is kind of the big picture idea of what he has been zeroing and circling around in chapter 11, 10, and he'll continue into chapter number 12, and that is advice, wise advice, by the way, wise advice to the youth. If you will look at chapter 11, if you would, and verse number 9. This is his advice. And initially, it doesn't sound like wise advice, but I'll explain why it is wise advice. Solomon's advice to the youth, to those that are still young, his advice is this: enjoy life while you're young because you're going to die. That's his advice. That's advice. That's coming from verse number 9. Enjoy life while you're young because you're going to get old and die. Okay? Now, for those of you of a certain age bracket, you think about death regularly. You think about retirement. You think about, your legacy. You think about, all kinds of things. You're thinking about those end-of-life years. Where is everything going to be prepared for and taken care of, and is everything set and in order, and will I have money for this, and will I won't be able to do that, and you're thinking about those things. But you didn't think about those things when you were younger. You didn't. In fact, in your teens and 20s, you didn't even think that death was something that was ever going to happen. It was the furthest thing from your mind. What was on your mind, typically speaking, is about self-gratification for the day of, and every once in a blue moon, you'd think a little bit past that and start thinking about the future and what am I going to do in my late 20s and 30s and the 40s, man. If you're a high schooler or if you're in your low 20s, 40s, that's old people. 40-year-olds, that's just old people. Until you get 40 and you're like, there's nothing old. Being 40 is not old at all. I feel good. I feel as good as I've ever felt. I'm thinking sharper. I'm better off than I've ever been before. But The youth, they don't think that way. They think, oh, the 40s, old. I hear youth tell me all the time they want to retire in their 40s. Some people do. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. But this is his advice right here. Verse number 9. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. I'm going to pause there for a moment. Now you go, wait a minute, we've been here already. We've seen this language before already in this book, and that's not good advice. Follow your heart, that's bad advice. Live for pleasure in your youth, that's bad advice. Now, this is not like in the past parts of the book of Ecclesiastes, because he ends the verse by saying this, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. In other words, follow your heart, live for pleasure, do the things that bring you joy in your youth, find enjoyment in life. But remember this, because I forgot this. I did not acknowledge this when I was in my youth, Solomon says. Remember, you will give an account to God for everything you do. That doesn't mean that you can't enjoy life, and it doesn't mean that you can't follow the desires of your heart. If you remember early on, Solomon had told his sons in Proverbs chapter number 3, that God will give you the desires of your heart as long as your heart is focused on Him. It is good advice to say, do what you want and obey God. You know, we don't often think that way, do we? We always treat it as if it's one side or the other. It's either I can live my life and do what I want to do, or I have to be submissive and only do what God wants me to do and be miserable in the process. Well, I can tell you right now, for years, for over 2 decades, I've been in ministry, and I've been happy the entire time. And I've been doing exactly what I want to do. In fact, I'm in ministry because I wanted to be in ministry. I desired to serve God in this capacity. You could argue, I followed my heart. I wanted to minister to people. I wanted to teach the scriptures. I wanted to see the gospel spread. That's what was in my heart. That's what I wanted to do. And by the way, it was also honoring and pleasing to God. I mean, obeying Him. And it's not one or the other. It's you can live your life doing what's in your heart to do, and at the same time, honoring God, pleasing God. And really realizing that at the end of your life, you can look back over your life and say, you know, I pursued the things that I enjoyed and the things that I wanted to do, and I found fulfillment and happiness in it. And at the same time, I was putting God first every step of the way. You can literally put God first in your life and still do the things that you want to do in life. That's not a contradiction. You have to change your heart. What do you want? Do you want the things that God wants? Do you desire the things that God desires? And if so, then you have quite a few years ahead of you that's going to be wonderful. But we know this, the point that Solomon's making, particularly in this verse, is that for the youth, and I'm going to speak directly to the youth right now, you are going to get old, whether you realize it or not. You don't think about it, it's never on your mind, but you're going to get old. Age will creep up on you. Age will creep up on you like an old pair of underwear. It'll just, you don't even, it just happens, and you're like, this is not comfortable, and I'm tired, and I didn't know aches could be all over the place, and I didn't know it would take so long for me to get going in the mornings, and I didn't know that I wouldn't sleep as long as I sleep. You know, teenagers sleep so many ridiculous. I have a teenager, a 16-year-old at home right now, and the boy can sleep and eat and sleep. I think that's all he does. He eats and sleeps. And it's like, come on, get up. You know, I'm up, you know, in fact, as I'm reading here, it's like, I must be an old, I don't think that I'm old, but I'm reading some of these other, he gives a description of old people later on. And I'm like, is that, he's talking about me. I'm not getting old. There's no way I can relate to these things. But the point is this, for you youth, you're going to get old. You're going to get old. It's going to happen. Are you thinking about it? Are you preparing for it? Acknowledging? Or are you just living for the moment? This is what I want right now, and this is what I want to do this week, and it's going to be fun. It's going to be awesome. But are you thinking past that? And do you realize that whatever it is that you're pursuing in life right now, you're going to give an account to God? He says in verse number 10, therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. That word vanity comes from that word that he has used 30-some times already. Hevel. It's mist. It's fleeting. Life it's going to be gone before you know it. You can pursue all the lustful, evil desires that you want in life, and you'll have to give an account to God for that and realize this is what you need to understand. Not only is life short on earth, you're going to die, but after that, you have all of eternity. All of eternity. And only what's done in this life, whether or not you believed in Christ, whether or not you trusted in God's word, whether or not you received his gospel, that's all that's going to matter in eternity. So he says, remove the sorrow from your heart, put away evil from your flesh. Number 2 is this. Look at chapter 11, verse number 7. He talks about remembering while you're young that life will be hard. He says in verse number 7, truly the light is sweet and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun, but if a man lives for many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. Now, for us that are older, we think about the hardships of life more than, as you get older, you think about that even more so, the hardships of life, the dark days that lie ahead. But you know as well as I do, you remember back when you were younger that you didn't think about that. I remember the first crash that happened, just a couple of years ago, 2008, and I was a lot younger then, didn't really have any investments, didn't really think about money that much, and didn't even realize it was going on, didn't even think about it. Wasn't on my mind. Had no fear about that, losing money or anything like that. But that's how a youthful mind would think. And when you're young, you don't think that someday you may have a car crash, or someday you may go bankrupt, someday you may lose your job, someday you're going to hear from the doctor that you have cancer, someday something bad, a dark day lies ahead. You don't think about those things when you're young. You just think every day is going to be sunshine and roses and wonderful. Well, let me remind you, there are just as many nights as there are days. And life is going to have lots of sunny, bright, wonderful days, but life also is filled equally with just as many dark days. And Solomon says to the youth, remember that. If you'll acknowledge while you're young that, yes, there's no avoiding it. There are going to be dark days in life. When the dark days come, you won't fall prey to giving up on life. So many people choose suicide in life because they just can't cope with the realities that's going on in their lives. Like, this should never happen to me. I should have never lost my job. This breakup should have never happened. I can't believe this is going on. This was the career that I had worked for all my life. How can this possibly be happening to me? I want out of this. This is too stressful. It's too much. This is not what I wanted in life. What, you didn't think bad things would ever happen to you? You thought that you were immune to that? You thought that you'll never get sick? You'll never break a leg? You'll never lose a job? You'll never have struggles? You see, life is filled with hardship. That's part of the human experience. And when you're young and you realize that it's not just roses and puppy dogs, there are going to be rough days ahead. It helps you to realize that that's part of the experience. It's part of the journey. And you're not in it alone. God's there with you. God will carry you through those dark days. And when the weight is too much, he will lift the burden off of you. And when you need the help to get through life, he is there. And so Solomon here gives wise advice to the youth that they need to remember life. Yes, it's wonderful, and you have a lot of energy, and you have a lot of excitement, and you've got a lot of ambition when you're young. But don't forget, you're going to have hiccups, and expect that in life. And number 3, and this is the most important advice that he's going to give here. Look at chapter 12 and verse number 1. He tells the youth to remember their Creator. And I love the entire way that he phrases this. He says in verse number 1 of chapter 12, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. Now, of all the words that he could have used, there's a plurality of words for God in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew language. But he chose Creator. I love this. Over the years, if I'm speaking to an atheist or an agnostic or someone that's a seeker, or if I'm just witnessing out on the street to someone about Jesus, I almost exclusively, when I talk about God, I don't really ever say God. Sometimes I may say Jesus or talk about him, but I use the word creator more than anything else. Because everyone at some point has to come to terms, and it's more helpful when it's in your youth. You were created. You have a creator. And you're only being sustained in the moment by your creator. And if you have a creator, that means that you're owned. That makes him have ownership over you. He created you, so therefore he owns you. And if he's sustaining you, then that means that he has a purpose for you. And so your purpose of existence is connected to your creator. One of the verses in the book of Revelation that has had some of the most impact in my life for many, many years is Revelation 4:11. You are worthy, O Lord, worthy. You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you have created all things, and by your will they are and do exist. As a younger man, that passage had profound implications to me. For the first time, I acknowledged that there is a creator God. All these thoughts of multiple gods or multiple faiths or multiple ideas, but then the reality that there's one God who in the Old Testament refers to himself as the God of gods and the Lord of lords. He's over everything, who is the creator of the universe and the sustainer of the universe. You just read Genesis chapter number 1, it tells us that he created everything. If you get to the end of that chapter, that leaves no room for other gods, other ideas, other deities. If there's a universe, and he made everything in it, and he is over it. And the Bible tells us that Christ, that Jesus is the one who is the creator of all. This is what the Gospel of John, chapter number 1, tells us. You can read Colossians, chapter number 1. You can read Hebrews, chapter number 1. All of them tell us the same thing, that Jesus is the one who spoke all things into creation. And Jesus is the one who sustains all things. In other words, you are held together. You are kept in place. You are alive. Your heart continues to beat at this moment only because he wills it to. And if he had no more reason for your existence, you would just poof out of existence. But you are here because your creator made you. There's no such thing as an accident baby. There's no such thing as a life coming into existence that wasn't meant to be. God meant it to be. He created it. And if you are alive at this moment, it's because God's allowing you to be alive at this moment. And if you're sitting here in this room, it's because he has a purpose and a plan for your life, and maybe you haven't even figured it out yet. This is why the scriptures are so important. You have a creator, and you want to, I want to know who my creator is. I want to know, what is it that you want of me? What is it that I can learn of you? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of me being here? And so Solomon, it's almost as if he's taking his younger self and sitting himself down and saying, listen, while you're young, remember you have a creator. Remember your creator in the days of your youth. Maybe he's reflecting back to some of the things that his father said. And King David, Psalm chapter 8, verse number 3, David said, when I considered your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars, which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? When you realize that there is a creator God who created all things, and yet he wants to know you, and he made you, and he wants to have a relationship with you, and he has a purpose for you and a plan for you, and his thoughts towards you are thoughts that are good, pleasant, and he wants you to be happy. He wants you to be saved. He wants you to be redeemed. He's not willing that any of his creation should perish, but that all of them should come to repentance. It really changes the way, what your priorities are and what your perspective is on life. And so he tells the youth, remember your creator in your youth. But then he goes on in verse number 1, the end of it, he tells the youth, give your youth to God while you have youth. It's unfortunate that so many people want to serve God They never wanted to serve God ever in their glory days, but now that I think of my grandmother, basically in her 80s, was the very first time that she started going to church. Very first time she started going to church was in her 80s, and then she started wanting to serve God, and she started volunteering at the church and wished so badly that all those earlier decades she could have spent that time serving God and knowing God in those times. I'll never forget, this was probably 6 or 7 years ago. There was an elderly lady in her 90s that was attending here at the time. And she told me as she was leaving one of the services on a Sunday morning, she said, I've grown up going to church my entire life, and I never understood the gospel until today. And she said, I think I was one of the hypocrites that you were talking about. I was teaching through the Gospel Luke at the time. She said, I think I've lived my entire life as a hypocrite. I'm not a true Christian. And I watched over the months an absolute transformation in her life. She struggled with depression so bad, and that was washed away. And then she started in her 90s. I think it was 92, 93 when she started volunteering in the office here at the Cross Church every single week, folding bulletins and doing all kinds of whatever she could in her 90s. Just think, I wish those earlier years I would have known these things and understood these things. I wish that life couldn't have been squandered like it was. Well, he says in verse number 1 at the end, middle of it, he says that we should remember our Creator before the difficult days come. Speaking of the aged years in life. Now, these verses here, he's using Hebrew poetic language, and I'll explain it as I go through. He says, before the difficult days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. Or in other words, when the years of the aches and pains come. He says in verse number 2, while the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened and the clouds do not return after the rain. He's using, once again, poetic language here. What he's saying is, remember God, remember your Creator. While life has great outlook, while there's energy, while there's happiness, remember God while you actually have things to offer to God. He goes on to say in verse number 3, in that day when the keepers of the house tremble. Now that's, once again, symbolic language talking about your legs. When remember God, serve your Creator while your legs are still, workable and you're ready to go, you're ready to do. You're not bound to a wheelchair yet. You're not walking around with a walker yet. You're not straining to just move around. Remember God while you have those energetic legs to serve Him. He says, and the strong men bow down. This is referring to his shoulders. Remember God while your legs are strong and before your shoulders start to lose. I'm struggling with some shoulder injuries myself, and it seems like that's all the conversation I've been having with a lot of the guys around here. We all talk about either needing shoulder surgery or recovering from shoulder surgery or other people who have had shoulder surgery, and it's like we get into these long conversations here at the Cross Church about shoulder surgeries. Like, this is just what old people do. We just sit around and talk about how was your surgery? Are you about to have? Are you going to schedule a surgery? How did that go? I'm going to get one too. What did your doctor say? Oh, that's the same doctor I had. Did he? It's just like you talk all day long about your ailments, about your issues. He's like, remember your Creator before all these body parts start falling apart. He says, the verse number 3 there in the middle of it, when the grinders cease because they are few. That's your teeth. He said, serve God in your youth before your teeth start falling out. Before it gets too hard to eat good steaks like we did the other night, man. He says, remember God before those things fall out. Verse number 3, he goes on to say, and those that look through the windows grow dim. This is, once again, poetically talking about the eyes, before your eyes start to lose their sight. You got to remember back in Solomon's day, 3,000 years ago, it wasn't like they could have cataract surgery or laser surgery or wear particular types of eyeglasses. Like, serve God while you can. My personal conviction in the New Testament is that when Paul talked about his thorn in his side, the thing that he asked God to remove multiple times, and God says, my grace is sufficient for you. I think it was probably referring to his eyesight, because he wasn't able to write the letters that he wrote. He'd have someone else write it for him, and if he ever signed his name off at the end of it, he would talk about how big the letters were that he wrote to sign his name, and he talked about how he was guided around. So it would appear that the Apostle Paul had very bad eyesight, and it limited him from being able to do as much as he wanted to do for God. So Solomon here is saying, while you've got good eyesight, use it. Use it not just for your own glory, not for your own purpose, and not for your own agenda. Think about your Creator. Think about why you're here. Think about your purpose. In verse 4, he says, when the doors are shut in the streets and the sound of grinding is low. This is talking about before the opportunities of life are removed and the occupations that you once would do in the past are no longer there. You're in your retirement age now. You're too feeble, you're too old to be able to do some of the jobs that you would like to do. He says in verse number 4, end of it, when one rises up at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of music are brought low. It's just another poetic way of saying that you don't sleep very well at night because the chirping of a bird will wake you up, but at the same time, your hearing is going and you don't hear much anymore. You don't sleep well. You don't hear well. You don't walk well. You don't see well. Everything aches and pains. And the sad thing is, you want to do more for God now than you've ever in your whole life. But now you're limited. And now you can't do as much because the body is breaking down. He says in verse number 5, also they are afraid of height and terrors of the way. Now, when I was a youth, I was a bareback mountain climber. I didn't care about ropes or any of that. I just go to Colorado and climb some mountains and didn't think about that stuff. Jumped off waterfalls. I climbed up the middle of a waterfall one time. It's so stupid. Halfway up, I thought I was going to die too, because it was a kind of a rocky bottom. My brother and I, we were both idiots. We climbed up the middle of a waterfall together. And the water was so heavy, you can't even open your eyelids. You can't see. The weight is pressing down on you. You're clinging on to slippery rocks and stuff, and you don't know where to go next. And it's kind of hard to even figure out which way is up versus down. It's just so much pressure on you. You're disoriented. And I remember not finding another place to grab my hand or put my leg, and thinking, doggone it, this is a dumb way to die. Why did I follow my brother? Why did I let him talk me into this? Trying to climb this waterfall, and I'm just stuck there. And I'm like, okay, eventually my fingers are going to give out. I'm going to crash down into the rocks below me. I'm going to die. And this is the dumbest way to die. How did I ever get myself into this situation? And well, eventually, God got me out of it. He wanted me to go into ministry later on in life, so I figured out a way out of it to the side. But the problem that I can tell you right now, years later looking back, you know what my problem was? I didn't have any fear. I was like, let's climb a waterfall. Let's do it. That's smart. There was no fear, at least not until in the midst of it. But as you get older, you think about those things. I better not, is that ramp safe? I don't know if I want to walk on that. Let's drive a little bit further over here. Let's stay safe. Let's stay safe. You think about those things. You don't want to trip. You don't want to fall. Sometimes you fall and you can't get back up. You don't want to do that. He says you think about it. And the terror of the terrors in the way. He's like, well, I don't want to shop there. That might be dangerous. I don't want to do this. That might be dangerous. You think about those things. Notice what he says in verse number 5. When the almond trees blossoms, you know what that's referring to? That's a poetic way of saying when your hair turns white. A tree in full blossom here, an autumn tree in full blossom is white, and that's what he's referring to. When your hair turns white. Serve God. Think about your Creator before your hair turns white, because that means it's about to fall out too. And you serve God while you can. He says, and then he mentions the grasshopper is a burden. Now, I had to look this one up myself because I didn't quite understand what he was trying to explain here, because I don't follow nature that closely. Grasshoppers will hop around their entire life until they get old, and then they just crawl around. An old grasshopper doesn't have the power or the energy anymore to be hopping, jumping all over the place. And Solomon is drawing off of that, saying, young grasshoppers they're just bouncing all over, they're full of energy. Once they get old, though, they're just kind of crawling around on the ground. and their desires fail. He ends verse number 5 by saying, "For man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets." So this is ultimately what's going to happen. You're going to get old. Your body parts, one by one, are going to start to break down. The energy is going to go away. Your desires are going to be there. Mentally, you still have a lot of things to think about, and a lot of things to share, and a lot of things to say, and a lot of things you want to do. But physically, it's just not there anymore. And Solomon's saying to the youth, remember to serve God and to put Him first. Remember your Creator while you have the physical abilities to be able to do that. So verse number 6, once again, remember your Creator. Before the silver cord is loosed, that's a reference to the spine. Or the golden bowl is broken, that's a reference to the skull. And the pitcher shattered at the fountain, that's the picture of the lung. And the wheel broken at the well, that's a picture of the heart. He says before those, we've talked about some of those external things, but before some of the internal things of your body starts to break down as well, he says, remember your Creator. Remember your Creator. You know, my dad has served the Lord faithfully for decades now, served as a missionary, as a pastor, evangelist, and now in his retirement years, he spends all of the time that he can volunteering at the church that he serves at, and it's all voluntary. But he doesn't do as much these days because he just doesn't have the energy, and only half of his heart functions, and he loses the energy, loses the physical ability to be able to do as much, and it drives him crazy, drives him mad. Like, now I've got all this time in my hand, all these things that I want to do, and I've got years of studying the Bible, and I'm ready to get out and share more, do more, but physically, I can't give it. After a couple of hours, I'm shot, I'm done. He says in verse number 7, we'll wrap this up, then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. Once again, that word vanity, or meaningless in your Bible translation, it's the word hevel in Hebrew. Think of it more as a word meaning mist, vapor. It's your time here on earth. It's like a flower today and it fades tomorrow. It's gone. It's like a mist in the air, James tells us. It's here for just a short period of time and then it's gone. And then what after that? What after that? Well, you return back to the Spirit. That's what he says. You go to the dust. When you die, you're buried. You return, your body physically returns back to the earth. But then where do you go? Where do you become what you really truly are, a spirit, eternal spirit. Years ago, I don't know why it had such an impact on me, but it just really opened my eyes and really changed the way I think about a lot of things in life. Years ago, I had a Bible college professor. He paused in the middle of, I think we were in Corinthians, and he said, think about something for a moment. He said, hold your hand out. Move your fingers around. Look at yourself. Is that reality to you? Do you think that that's really what matters and what's most important? He said, let me remind you something. You are a spirit. This body that we're in, it's just temporal. It's a shell. Your spirit resides within it, and your spirit is eternal. Forever, somewhere, heaven, hell, somewhere, your spirit will be. Forever. That's reality. This is just temporal. This is just a moment. This is a fleeting thing. Here today, gone tomorrow. Live for the eternal. Think about the eternal. Focus on the eternal. Stop living in this reality, because this one is just gone. Gone. And then you're into eternity. And so Solomon says, while you have youth, while you have the energy, while you have the ability, give yourself to God. You'll regret it so much later on if you don't. Your life will be empty. Your life will be vanity. Your life will be a mist. It's here today and gone tomorrow. And then you become a spirit, and you will regret all those decisions you made. This is why he said back in chapter 11, you have to give an account to God. You're going to stand before God. Hebrews 9:27 tells us is appointed unto men once to die, and after this, the judgment. You're going to die once, and then you're going to stand before God, and you're going to give an account. What is the account, by the way? It's not going to be on, were you good enough to get into heaven? That's not what that judgment is. Did you believe the gospel? Did you receive the grace of Christ? Did you trust in him? Did you follow him? Did you repent from yourself and turn to him?